Are you feeling anxious, overwhelmed, and disenchanted by life, the universe, and everything? Maybe you're frustrated with the talking heads who say one thing and do something completely different. Yeah, me too. Welcome to People Watching, a podcast where we figure out what it looks like to become the role model we've always wanted by talking with real people who found real role models in their own lives. Together, we cut through all the noise and identify better sources of hope, creativity, and wisdom as we explore how we learn to make decisions about the kind of life we want to live. So join us. Let's do some people watching. This is your host, Megan J. Robinson. My guest today is Dr. Sandra Glahn, journalist and author, co-author, or editor of more than 20 books. Dr. Glahn is also professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary and the co-founder of a visual museum of women in Christianity. I first met Dr. Glahn when I took her course Writing for Publication while a student at DTS. She both terrified and encouraged me in equal measure because I thought I was a good writer before going into her class and quickly found out how much more I had to learn. Since leaving DTS, I followed Dr. Glahn's work with deep interest, especially as she's recently published Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians and Antiquity in the New Testament, which connects ancient Ephesus and early church history to questions of gender in society and faith communities today. In our conversation, we explore the themes of representation, leadership, and the historical context of women in Christianity. I especially appreciated hearing Dr. Glahn speak on the challenges of power dynamics and leadership roles, and her emphasis on the importance of discernment, humility, and integrity in fostering genuine connections and relationships. This was such a fun and fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to part one of our conversation. Welcome to the studio.
That tells you how long you've known me. That was pre-doctorate, right?
I know. And I finally realized why you did that, because you didn't want people to address you as Mrs. You didn't want people to address you by your first name because they needed to respect the role that you were in. And you didn't have your doctorate yet. So I love it.
And actually, I noticed that people tended to call women by their first names and then men doctor. And
Yeah.
so I didn't want our students to go away thinking that that was a legit way to operate in the world.
Right.
You want to use a parallel title. So, yep, that is exactly why we did that. And now I can tell what students I had what years, because those who call me Prof. Glahn knew me, before the doctorate. Yeah.
Before the doctorate. Awesome. Well, Dr. G, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
And as we get started, I would love for us to go through touchstones for our conversation, expectations that can shape our time together for ourselves and for our listeners. So would you start us off by reading the first one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Whatever we share is by invitation, not obligation. If either of us is not comfortable pursuing a topic, let's just say, I prefer not to share, thank you.
Thank you. And silence is also a partner in our conversation. Let's feel free to take a moment to reflect without immediately filling the space with words, and let's leave room for the inner teacher to whisper as well.
Be present as fully as possible. This is a space to acknowledge our doubts, fears, and failings as much as it is a space to share our joys, convictions, and successes.
And finally, let's ask open, honest questions. If we're not sure what the other meant in the question or statement, ask. It gives us a chance to clarify or rephrase. And by asking questions that we genuinely don't know the answer to, We allow room for surprise to be a great catalyst of insight. Awesome. So, Dr. G, since I had you as a professor and that was not this environment to get to know you,
That's right.
I would just love to hear a little bit about the things that stand out for you in your life as meaningful that you feel have really shaped who you
Mhm.
are and how you've come to be here today.
Well, I'd love to. I had fabulous parents and I grew up in the foothills of the mountains in Oregon. I'm a fifth generation Oregonian. And so my parents would take us camping. There, I spent many, many nights in a cold, wet sleeping bag. Liked camping a whole lot better once they got a travel trailer, which, as you can imagine, with 5 kids and all their gear, was just, for my mother's sanity. But yeah, can you imagine? Yeah. But anyway, I have more respect for them the older I get and the more I have, grandchild. Wow, mom, you're a rock star. But anyway, they gave us a deep, deep beauty, a deep appreciation for beauty. And I would say that, if there was money to be spent, it was usually spent on experiences,
Mm,
especially if they involve beauty more than things. So we had a house that one window looked out on the Willamette River and the other looked out on Mount Hood. And that is not because we had money. It was because that had been a priority for my parents. And that has really stayed with me. In fact, I live in Dallas and have lived since the 80s. And one of the things that my husband and I have decided is that even though Dallas is not a terribly beautiful place compared to where we are from, that it at least affords us affordable airfare to get out of Dallas and go other places. We have a bunch of hubs here, both Southwest and American Airlines are here, and that makes it generally a little cheaper to go all over, at least the United States. So beauty is a core value. And then my father was an engineer, but he also had a Bachelor of Arts because he loved poetry. He loved reading. When he was dying, my younger sister and I had to fly out to Oregon and figure out what we were going to do with all the books in his library
mm,
because there were so many of them and books are heavy. And these days people, with that many books have Kindles, but just,
yeah.
it was so wonderful to discover books on his shelf that I didn't know he loved. And also to see what poems the road less traveled was, he had written it out in his own hand, longhand, and to just discover more of him through
Mm,
some of that. So there's the deep love for books, lots of stacks of books coming in and out of the library, which of course is great if you have 5 kids and not a ton of money. The
sure.
library is your friend. And every week we are allowed massive stacks of library books. Love of books, love of beauty. And then when I was 10, I promise you I won't walk through every decade, but these are really, really important. My parents decided to move to Washington, D.C. My father worked for the government and he took a lateral move because he wanted to expose us to culture. And there are
Mhm.
so many free museums in the DC area. And we spent every weekend seeing the up and down the whole Eastern Seaboard. And
Yeah.
so
Grew
those
up in
three,
DC. I grew up in
that,
DC.
I think we knew that at one
Yeah,
point. Yeah,
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 yeah. So,
yeah.
yeah, 3 museums for the
Oh my
win.
goodness. Yes,
Yeah,
everywhere. And so it was just those three things: beauty, the arts, and history are deeply embedded in my value system and a big part of who I am.
I love that. I mean, of all the things for your parents and your dad to leave, I mean,
Yeah.
just to be able to have that tangible connection of the books, and I imagine
Yeah.
he probably wrote in them and
He did.
annotated and
Yes, he did.
yeah,
He would have
yeah.
been a librarian's nightmare, but it didn't matter because he owned them. And it made it really fun. And, and like when after he died, to pick up his Bible and to see what, the I have fought the fight, I've finished the race. Like, who says that?
Mhm.
Not too many people can just be
Yeah,
satisfied with that. And just,
yeah,
I feel like he left notes behind for me, just
yeah,
in his margin notes, things he underlined,
yeah,
that are
yeah.
still encouraging to me.
That's so cool. I mean, it's almost a little bit like time travel in a way.
It is, yes, a little bit, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So when you lived in DC, was that where like you kind of grew up and then stayed, or did you go back to Oregon?
So I fell in love. Well, so I began my faith journey in the DC area, um, and met a guy in the youth group who was an absolute mess, and his name was Gary Glahn. Oh, since you call me, Dr. G, that stands for Glahn. So you know where the story's going. I just couldn't believe the dumb choices this guy was making. But he came home from college one weekend and said, I've decided to get my act together. This was not a line. People swear it's a line, but it's not a line. He asked if I would do some trial run dates with him because he'd never been a decent guy on a date and he wanted to ask out this girl named Diane, and we had become friends. And I was like, of course, I would be happy to do that. I like somebody else. He likes somebody else. And so we had a couple of dates where we were just trying out what it would be like to just go have fun. And he never did
Okay.
ask her out. And that was the end of
Oh my gosh.
me having a crush on that other guy. And the morning after we decided to, go steady, which was the phraseology in that day, my
Yeah.
dad
Yeah.
informed us he had taken early retirement from his government job and had taken a new job as a county engineer back in Oregon. And this is the days before internet. So I was middle of my junior year. I was not happy with
Yeah.
my father at all. But, I am glad I didn't get married in my senior year. So
Sure.
there's that, I mean, I couldn't see that we needed time, and distance
Sure.
didn't hurt us one little bit. But
Yeah.
so DC was very formative in history. And then as soon as I fell in love, Dad yanked me out of that part of the world
Sure.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
took me back home.
Hmm.
Mm,
Did Dad just get a new job?
yeah. Anyway.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to hear a little bit about your faith journey because it does sound like your parents had that as part of their home and as part of your family. But how did faith become yours? How did that become part of who
Yeah,
you are?
great question. So we were in a mainline denomination, and I know many of them are truly Christian, but the ones we were a part of were not. It was very
Oh,
much, work your way to heaven. And so I was afraid. And I even had an altar in my room. I was just thinking, I knew I was a little liar. I knew I'd ish. And it frightened me.
mm,
And there was a girl in my school who came back from summer vacation, and she was a different person. And she had become a believer in Christ. And I wanted what she had. Like, it was
mm,
clearly a difference in her life. And my parents, being really good parents, acknowledged that where we were going was not what I needed for my life. And I was so mad because my mom called the youth pastor of a church that a bunch of our neighbors went to that had a great youth group, and without telling me, and said, I think my daughter would do much better in your youth group than the one she's going to. Would you mind sending some kids down to meet her? Because it would be really awkward for her to just show up by herself. And she told me when they were on their way to our house, like, so suddenly mom had 3 syllables, right? Mom, like, you're ruining my life. Stop meddling. But of course, that's exactly what happened. They came. I love these people. They invited me to their youth group. And that, of course, is where I met Gary Glahn. And it was just a
okay.
really solid church. And
Mhm.
they were really very into mentoring and making sure that it wasn't just for fun. We had lots of fun and took ski trips, and there were so many things to do in the DC area and beyond. But they were concerned for our spiritual growth. And little by little, every member of my family of 7, except for one, ended up sort of reprioritizing,
Okay.
believing.
Okay.
So then I saw my parents really radically change through my later high school years. When by the time we moved back to Oregon, it was just my younger sister, me. I'm 4, she was 5, fourth and fifth. And for a while, it was really hard on my older siblings because they felt like we got a very different family life. Our family life had been okay, but it was super tight after that. Like, we just
Mhm.
really just enjoyed each other so much. And I think they felt a little left out. They'd left home, but they'd come back and see something was very different.
Yeah.
And so I remember a counselor friend one time told me, you will never have a midlife crisis. I was like, why do you say that? And he said,
Interesting.
well, because you've seen your parents change so dramatically in their 40s and 50s. It will never cross your mind. You can't start over or change, that you're too old. And he was right. In fact, I got my doctorate at 52. I
Yeah.
just have never had in my mind, it's too late, or I can't change, or, I'm
Okay.
too stuck. And apparently, um, a role model doing
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
really formative in thinking about when you're stuck or when you're not.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Gosh, there's so many
So many
questions.
ways
Like,
we could
which one?
take this. Yeah, I know.
I would love to know. So when I was in your class. I was in your writing for journalism. I forget
Yeah.
the exact title.
It's
Writing for publication.
yeah, writing for publication, I think.
And to this day, every time I am writing, I am like in the back of my mind, Prof. Glahn is going to redline my B verbs. I got to get rid of my B verbs.
My goodness. Oh my goodness.
Actually, just really fantastic rubric. Like if
Oh,
you want to tighten up your writing, like real fast, just
use strong verbs. Yeah.
yeah. And so I knew that you were working on your PhD at University of Texas. Is that right?
Yeah, the Dallas campus, yes.
Dallas. And I would love to hear what what that was, how it got started, what led you to the
Oh, it was
PhD.
so fun. It was
Yeah.
so fun. Well, I was teaching the grad level before I had my master's because I was a professional writer.
Okay.
And, most of my students didn't know this, but one of my clients was Barney and Friends. And I didn't want them to know that because most people hated Barney at that point of their lives. But anyway, so I had my own business as a writer. But to keep the job, I discovered I really loved teaching. But to keep the
Mhm.
job, I had to get a doctorate. And so I looked into, there were a pretty good number of doctorates available in the Dallas area. But the one that appealed to me most allowed a creative dissertation. At that point, I was publishing medical suspense with a co-author who's a medical doctor. And so the thought that I could write fiction as part of my doctorate was the initial pull. Well, as it turns out, you really can't do that. But that was what drove me to the program at
Mhm.
UTD because it was a doctorate in the humanities aesthetic studies.
Okay.
Aesthetic studies is a three-pronged doctorate. A lot of people think I studied anesthesiology. They see the AE together and,
Yeah.
so, or they think, well, you got a doctorate in beauty. Well, no. So the way aesthetic studies works is it's a third history, which I love, a third art, which was lit in my case, and then it's a third philosophy, but not necessarily like Kierkegaard. It can be tracing the history of ideas. So I wanted to trace the history of ideas about gender and what's been considered masculine and feminine since the first century BC to today. Pink isn't universally girl color, right? Blue, what is culturally influenced and what is universal? I was very interested in sort of sussing that out. And the beauty of that was then I had to do all that and write a nonfiction dissertation, but then I had to write a novel that brought the three together. Well, I know. So since then, the professor said you really had to do two. So he said, I've quit recommending the program because just get a degree with a dissertation and then go write a novel, but have the doctorate behind your name.
Right. Right. Right.
It took me it took me 10 years to finish. It was a lot. But anyway, today I'm glad I did it because,
Yeah.
retrospect is yeah. Anyway, so
Yeah.
the novel was, I had to make the point of view character a female. And she is set in first century Ephesus. So I chose 100 BC to 100 AD in Ephesus. And basically the storyline was that there was an earthquake that opened up sort of a cave area, and she discovered the apostle Luke's notes for a third installment after Luke and Acts, which was the interviews
Yeah.
with the women.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It was really fun. And someday I'll, call our mutual friend at IVP and say, hey, I have a novel I want to publish with you.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
just sitting there as I've worked on other stuff. But I also had to do a deep dive into Artemis of the Ephesians in antiquity and the New Testament. And that was the primary focus of my dissertation.
Okay.
Who was she? And I really wanted historians to be vetting that.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah.
blast. I'm not going
Yeah.
to lie.
Yeah.
I always told myself I might die doing this because I'm certainly the oldest student in my class. But even if I never get the doctorate, I have loved every single class I've done. I've loved all the research. It's just given me structure. So
Yeah.
lifelong learner.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And was the research that you did was that what led to your recent book, Nobody's Mother, that you were
Yes,
published?
it is.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I read. I did
Oh,
read.
did you? Okay.
Yes.
Good for you. Yeah.
Yes.
It took 10 years of
Took 10 years.
yeah. Yeah. Took a long time to research it. And of course, a lot of the research that I did, I was looking at inscriptions in the first century. And of course, I got to the end of the book, and then somebody released all the inscriptions about women in Ephesus, like in one volume. And on the one hand, I'm like, I spent years translating that stuff. On the other hand, it's a little bit like getting the cheat sheet after you've taken an exam to make sure, that you
Right, right.
like
Yeah,
test your results before you put them out in public and say this
sure,
is right. And
sure.
I did find a couple of things to correct. So then I felt validated that, okay,
There you go. There you
it's
go.
mostly good, but I'm also glad somebody else did the work. So
Sure.
it's
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. Well, how did you so with looking at gender across history globally,
Yeah.
like trying to
Oh
understand
my
that,
goodness.
is that really what kind of led you into looking at women in first century BC, first century AD, and then into women in the church, or how did that come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a little bit the other way around.
Okay.
I looked at a complicated passage in Book of First Timothy that has a line, "She will be saved through childbearing," and I had gone through infertility, and I had been told that it was actually a local saying about Artemis. And that Paul had sort of taken and put a Christian spin on it, which he does a lot of times. He'll quote a local poet and then, kind of change the meaning for fun. So I was very curious. I read Acts 19, which talks about, people chanting great as Artemis, like we know that she was in Ephesus. I wanted to know not who was Artemis in the 5th century BC, not who she was in the 8th century BC, not who she was in the 4th century AD. I wanted to know who was she at the time of the earliest Christians, and does vocabulary relating to her come into play with this saying, saved through childbearing. It started as a personal journey for
Mm,
myself, and then it became sort of like a Indiana Jones sort of mystery to solve. What does it mean, and what does it say? And
mm,
I did definitely come away seeing all kinds of words in that epistle that looked like they could have come out of the Artemis lexicon.
mm,
And so that parallel, as I'm wrestling with what does the text say, what does it mean for me, I'm also discovering through part of the history part of my studies that I had sort of been taught that, women and leadership in the church really was never a thing until Betty Friedan came along in the, second wave feminism. And that is just a pot of crock to put it nicely. And so again, I was like, well, okay, so what were women doing? And the inscriptions show some of that. But
mm.
one of the things I discovered, and I have to credit some of my African American friends who, oral history is legit. And we have a tendency to only look at written history for what's legit. And interestingly enough, you've got inscriptions that are written, and we've kind of ignored those. But I began to see that there is a whole visual history that is told in the same way that during slavery, people would make quilts and tell stories in quilts, even though they were pre-literate. Something very similar happens in Christianity with the Mosaic record and women. And so, because with the Protestant Reformation, we saw a word in Scripture, the New Testament, the word saint, and we saw the apostles applied it to every believer. And so in our effort to try to align ourselves with their meaning, we threw out all the saints of the church except Patrick and, Valentine, because they had the best parties. And we kept their days, but everybody else's day, or like, we don't do those. Well, in the process of getting rid of saints' days, we lost the
Mm,
biographies that earlier people of faith and people in other traditions, Christian traditions today
mhm.
know. Some of my research on the visual history was looking at who really are our foremothers
Yeah,
and when did they start leading. It appears they go all the way back to Eve. Yeah,
maybe just a little.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there you go.
I would, yeah, and I would love to start thinking about that a little bit more because that, like, this season's theme that I'm working on for this podcast, this first podcast, is about the lives of women. Because, you know, it's interesting because I personally was never raised to be like stereotypical female. My parents
Mhm.
have always said, you can do whatever you want as long as you can support yourself.
Wow. That's great.
which has just been kind of and I did not realize that that was not how a lot of women are
Yeah.
taught or
Yeah.
encouraged or raised. And my dad also every Saturday took me to the library. Still like
So,
my favorite memory growing up, going with my
so
dad to
great.
the library.
That's a
And
great memory.
it is fantastic memory. So all of that to say, I was not raised to want to be a wife or a mom. I mean, that was available to me, but
Yeah.
it was not something that I was said, "This is the only thing that you are able
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do or want." And but also to recognize that in some respects, that is where so many women still are, is first
Yeah.
a wife and a mom,
Right.
and then shoehorning all of these other roles in the world into their
Yeah.
lives and still trying to figure out how to manage or navigate or integrate all of those things. And so for me, the lives of women is just how are women learning to do this? How are we learning to
Mhm.
do that? And I've been fascinated because I've talked to so many who are wives, who are moms, who are working, who have also made the conscious choice to not have children, who don't have
Mhm.
children because they can't have children. And I am also at a point where I'm reaching an age where the question of whether or not I can have children is
Mm.
slowly closing. Like that question's being answered simply through
Mm.
circumstance
Yeah.
and accessibility. And I've had to wrestle with the fact that even though I never wanted children, I
Yeah.
also
That's different
thought I
from,
would have a
yeah.
chance.
Yeah.
I thought that that would still be an option, and that hasn't been an option. So I've had to wrestle with my own
Mm.
feelings of grief and
Yeah.
confusion and now what? And
Mm.
who am I if I don't have that legacy, that kind of a
Yeah.
legacy?
Yeah.
All of these questions. Lots to get around to. The question of it doesn't seem like a lot of women these days have women to look to or
Yeah.
have
Mm.
examples
Mm.
of how they've navigated that. And I would love to love to dig into what you've learned in your own studies and your own work. But first, I would just like to quick step back and I would love to hear how do you understand role models? Like, what is that when you hear that?
Yeah.
What does
Yeah.
that conjure up for you, or how do you respond to that?
Probably representation is the first thing of just,
Mm,
it's hard to imagine something until you see it.
mm,
For example, so one of the classes I now teach is 3 weeks in Italy, looking at medieval art and spirituality. And that's sort of where I discovered the visual record. It was by accident, a happy accident. But I had an African American student with me 2 summers ago, and she walked into a church with me that has on one side of the just below the ceiling is 22 female martyrs, 20 of
mm.
whom are virgins, not in a purity culture kind of virginity, but in an agency kind of like this was a choice that they made and it was not a popular choice. And
Yeah.
so you're flanked as a worshiper walking in, you're flanked on the left upper side with all these women, and then the right side, the parallel is gender parity. So you have men and women who've gone before, and their names are over each of them in the mosaic, so we know who they are. And I had a student who did the deep dive to get each of their narratives. And so we know who they were in a brief bit of their story. But when a student walked in with me, she burst into tears and
Mm.
said, because it was 6th century and before. And she's like, I was there. And what she meant was there are women in our history of the church. She'd only ever been taught the church councils. And if you just hear about major decisions, you just don't know about the everyday people and their stories.
Mm.
And representation matters. I mean, we hear it, but it has this visceral response in students when they start getting the specific stories.
Mm.
And particularly for my single students, interestingly enough, because of course, the early Christians are not focused on marriage at all. It's quite the opposite. It's the Reformation that overdoes it the other direction, right? So if the church overdoes it in the beginning, it's overdoing singlehood and then, overcompensates and then everybody's got to be married. But anyway, for her to see, so she's single and just working through some of the very things you're just talking about, and to see all these heroes that are single women, and
Mm.
that the church would have been remembering every week as they walked into their worship space. She's like, where else in your world do you see that many female single women held up as role models in the church? And it was really moving. So that's part of what drives me is I know that there are little girls that want to be leaders in the church, and it takes seeing one for them to start dreaming. That
Yeah.
if you have gifts of leadership, young woman, you don't have to stifle it. You don't have to clip those butterfly wings. There's a place
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I recently just met an amazing woman who's working um, in as a teaching assistant in seminary while she's going through seminary, and she had been on church staff at the early part of her seminary education, and she started digging into one of the professors at this particular seminary. Essentially teaches theology as church history and church history as theology, and
Wow.
so you're just really,
Wow.
which of course, because I mean, isn't theology always a response to your time and place?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do you navigate these new questions that might come up?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that came up was, as we call it, complementarian versus egalitarian
Yeah.
understanding. And she started digging into the text, wrestling with the text, and taking it to the church where she was, and just basically just kind of kept getting pushed and
Mm.
pushed and
Mm.
pushed off and pushed off and pushed, and eventually just, found herself pushed out. And understandably, this is a traumatic experience
Yeah.
to realize that a place I thought I was welcome, well, I'm
Yeah.
actually not welcome.
Only if I stay within certain boundaries. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And
Whew.
it is. And, to varying degrees, I've experienced that.
Mm.
I would say my time at DTS was
Mm.
what I would call a benign patriarchy.
Mm.
It was never malicious. I never felt like threatened or poorly treated. I was
Yeah.
always very graciously treated, that I will say.
Yeah.
But there was also a sense that there were very specific places I was allowed to be and not allowed to be. But for a variety of
Yeah.
reasons, that was just kind of like, I don't think this is a place where I'm going to be able to
Yeah.
do what
I
I
tell
want to do.
people there are 100 DTSs because, right? I mean, just it depends on what pocket you land in.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm
Mm.
I am so grateful for my time at DTS. I will never,
Yeah.
I would
Sure, of
never have
course.
been able to meet God the way that I
Mm.
did there.
Mm.
And it's when people meet me now, they're
They're
like,
like, you went
and they
there?
find out, yeah, they're like, you were there. It's like,
Yep.
quite literally, God told me to go there. That is what I have to say about that. But all of that to come back around to this idea of representation. And I think I think that really is something to sit with, because as I have been thinking about role models, and I have been thinking about the people that have been most influential or most impactful for me, it's been men. It's always been men.
Mm. That makes
And
sense.
and I remember saying I had a team of women that I worked with, and when I was heading up a department, and I remember saying I didn't have any kind of a model or any kind of an example of a female leader.
Mm.
So I feel like I'm just out here with a machete hacking a path.
Yeah.
If you would like to follow, here you go. Like if this is a path you want to
Yeah.
go, here.
Yeah.
But otherwise I'm out here with machete.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah.
What I would love to know, as you studied these women of the church, as you've introduced your students and other people to them, and as they've also kind of opened up their own experiences to
Yeah.
you, what has that done for your studies, for your spiritual life, for your relationships? What does that look like for you?
I think the first thing it's done is it shifted my view of myself. I have thought of myself as a pioneer in Christian women's leadership within evangelical spaces. And it's like, I haven't invented anything. Paula was translating with Jerome way back, right? Fourth century, 400s. And so I think that actually has given me a sense of relief.
Mm.
That because there's a little fear that can nag you in the back of your head going, am I a maverick in a bad way? Is this a bad thing? And then to discover you're very welcome in a huge cloud of witnesses.
Mm.
Yes, you're unique. You're uniquely you, but you're not. I'm not the first person to take Greek, or the
Sure.
female Greek professor at Dallas Seminary is not the first person to teach first female to teach anybody Greek. It's
Sure.
very, very long tradition.
Yeah.
It's just not familiar to most Protestants, and I think since church history often does not include the women in church history, the people who then teach us history just don't know what they don't know.
Mm.
As you said, it's not malicious intent most of the time. Nevertheless, you didn't get the education because, people didn't know that there's that whole cloud. So anyway, I think it brings a sense of humility and relief. But also I think it raises my view of embodiment. To see, think about it. Like if I'm a 17-year-old girl and I want to become an engineer, I'm going to go try to find a female engineer and just see her in the flesh engineering. There's just something about seeing what you want to do embodied that makes you say, yeah, I can do this. It's been done. And I think that's true of character, of finding people ahead of us down the road in terms of character. It's true in terms of, my brother is an art curator at a museum, and I'm working on the Visual Museum of Women and Christianity. And it's like, okay, tell me, I'm not really that familiar with iconographies, but he is an Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, a Capello Christian. And so iconography is perfectly normal part of his life. And so I'll say, so why does Eve have a black foot here? And he's like, well, you're not going to like the answer. That particular iconographer is probably saying, the fall is all her fault. I'm just saying, okay, well, that was my hunch, but, thank you. Somebody who knows more, and just even learning how to preface that instead of like, I'm going to have to pass that on and I don't have to hesitate about it, but I could also express that not excited about this interpretation, but here it is.
Here you go. Yeah.
Here you go. Just, I don't know, just seeing it done in the flesh by somebody else who's doing it well helps me envision how to do it well.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you get started with the visual gallery?
So it's visualmuseum.gallery for those who are listening. Years ago, somebody who was loosely associated with DTS, the school where I teach, saved a part of every dollar she'd ever earned and left it in terms of millions. She was not a millionaire, but she saved it all up. And I think she was a librarian, actually. And she had seen that many professors have great ideas for projects, but they don't have funding. Because, professor's salary is, you have lots of education, but not necessarily lots of figures in your salary. And so she left a grant that we could apply for, that the faculty could apply for, up to, I think, $5,000 for 3 years. And then I have to take a 3-year break. So let somebody else have a chance. But anyway, I applied to hire a student who was already going on the Italy trip with me, who was a professional photographer, to do a work for hire assignment. And I would point to the women that I wanted photographed, because when I got home and wanted to include them in my lectures, they were either behind a paywall, or they were copyrighted, or they were clip art. And I wanted the actual beautiful art.
Yeah.
Sites are getting much more generous now, but it was harder even 5 years ago to get access, which meant then women were not visually represented in my work. So I came home, I had all this great content. She published a 2-page beautiful spread of it in Christianity Today about women in the early church. And that made it easier for me to then join with people from 2 other institutions. One was Houston Christian, one was Wheaton College, and apply for a Luce grant. I think the Luce family owns like Time or Life. I think it's Time Magazine. And so they give these grants through the accrediting institution that our school has. And they were asking us to partner. They wanted us to find partners so that different schools would collaborate and bring their expertise together. So we wanted male, female. We wanted our three schools. George Calantis at Wheaton grew up literally a stone's throw from the Acropolis in
Oh,
Athens. He has a beautiful, Greek accent, and he can read Greek. He didn't have to learn it like I did with vocab cards. Like, he grew up with it. And so the three of us came together and applied for a $50,000 grant to
great.
get, one, more students to go and take photos, but B, to set up a site where every photo on the site is a free download and it's high res, and
Okay.
to just encourage people to use it. Well, then Lynn Cohick down at Houston Christian started assigning her master's students to research. Tell us, who is Agatha? Who is Agnes? Who is St. Lucy? Who are these people? What's their story? What's sort of the, we're not trying to cut through myth, but we're also not writing a hagiography. We're just trying to keep it academic.
Great.
And so we're finding, to our surprise, we thought people would just come and use it as visual, interest and use it in their presentations. Some people are using it devotionally to become
Okay.
familiar with
Okay.
hundreds of women that they don't know about, that
Yeah.
were clearly well known in the past and are clearly
Yeah.
well known in other branches of Christianity.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss part 2 of this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I hope you found something that resonated with you and that helps you become more hopeful, creative, and wise in your own life. Please share this with someone who you think would love this conversation, and like, subscribe, and leave a comment or a review to boost the show. Shalom.